My name is Alina. I am 32 years old. Now I live with my son and I love him a lot because without him, I don't have anyone in my life. So today, I want to share the hardest story of my life. It's not just story. It was my life, full of pain and memories. So stay with me until the end, so you don't lose any moment. The rain was falling without stopping, and the cold wind burned our bones. I held my child's hand tightly and stopped my breath. A few minutes ago, it was our home. It was safe, warm, and full of memories. Now it was gone. My husband looked at us with angry and cruel eyes and said, "Go! You do not belong here anymore." I had no choice. With my small child in my arms, I had to leave everything behind. Our first steps were on the wet and slippery sidewalk. Every car sound and every shadow felt like a danger to our lives. My child cried softly. The cold rain touched his skin, and I had no safe place for him. Our stomachs were empty. Strong hunger made our bodies weaker every minute. But there was no way back. Our steps took us into a dark alley. Suddenly, we heard the rough footsteps of a man far away. My heart beat like crazy, and I held my child closer. We were ready to run at any moment. At any second, a danger could end our lives. Night came, and we found no safe place. The ground was wet. The cold wind was blowing. We had to sit on a cracked sidewalk. My child was shaking in my arms. I felt like the world was ending. But to stay alive, we could not stop even for one moment. We had to move forward, even when every step brought more pain and fear. In the deep darkness, I had only one thought. We must stay alive, even if everything is lost. The rain was still falling, and the wind pushed us back again and again. I held my child tighter and looked at every sound of footsteps and every car with fear. Every shadow and every movement in the dark felt like a threat to our lives. Our stomachs were crying from strong hunger, but there was no shop and no person around us. Only empty and cruel streets. Suddenly, we heard the rough voice of a man from the next alley. My heart beat like a drum inside my chest. If he noticed us, I did not know what would happen to us. But there was no way back. We had to cross a busy street and find some kind of shelter. With tired and cold legs, I started to run. Every step brought more fear and pain. My child was shaking in my arms, but there was still no safe place. Cars passed near us very fast. At any moment, an accident could happen. After many long alleys, we found a half-broken building. The roof was cracked and the walls were wet, but at least we were safe from the rain and wind. We sat down. I held my child and took a deep breath. This unsafe shelter was maybe our only chance to stay alive. In the cold and dark, I thought, if we can pass this night, maybe tomorrow we can find some food and continue our way to survive. This was the first lesson of street life. Fear, hunger, and cold, but hope, even in very small moments, can keep you alive. Morning came. but the cold was still painful. My child held my hand tightly, but in one short moment, his hand slipped from mine. For 1 second, my heart stopped. No, no. I heard my own voice shaking with fear. He disappeared into a small, wet, and dark street. I ran and called his name, but the rain and wind swallowed my voice. Every alley and every shadow was a danger. Cars passed very fast, and my child was close to going under the wheels. My breath was short. My heart was beating fast with fear. Hunger burned my bones. Suddenly, I heard his crying. Only a few more steps, and a terrible accident could happen. With my last strength, I ran to him and held him tightly in my arms. Fear, cold, and hunger came together in one moment. But one truth became clear. We were alive, and we had to continue, even when the world was against us. Night came again. This time, with my child in my arms, we sat on a cracked bench. The wind and rain were still dangerous, but for a short moment, my child's smile and the soft sound of his breathing brought a small spark of hope to my heart. In the dark, I understood. Surviving is possible, even in absolute fear, if we fight for each other and for our small future. Came again, and the cruel rain washed the streets. I held my child's hand tightly and walked through the dark alleys with tired feet. Every shadow and every far sound felt like a danger to our lives. But I could not stop even for one moment. I had to find a safe place, even if it was only half safe. After many turns, we saw an old and cracked building. The door was half closed, and the roof was broken, but at least it protected us from the rain. We went inside and sat on the wet ground. My child put his head on my shoulder, and for the first time after many hours, he took a calm breath. Hunger was still there, but a cup of water and a small piece of bread, which we got from a kind seller, brought a little peace. The sound of wind and rain was still worrying, but we had found a shelter, even if it was broken and temporary. In the dark, I promised myself, if we pass this night, maybe tomorrow we can find some food and continue our way to survive. It was a short moment, but this small spark of hope was enough to keep us moving. Morning came, but the cold and wind were still hurting us. The half-safe shelter from the night before gave us peace only for a few hours. I held my child tightly and walked through wet and dark alleys to find some food. Suddenly, two strange men came out of the shadows. Their looks were hard and dangerous. One of them said, "What are you doing here?" His move showed that they wanted to hurt us. My heart was beating fast. My hands were wet with fear. I held my child closer and said loudly, "We do not want trouble, please." But there was no answer. They only came closer. With every step, the fear grew bigger. The only way to stay alive was to run. We ran through the rainy alleys. At any moment, we could hit a wall or fall under a car. Cold, Tiredness and hunger burned our bodies together, but nothing could stop us from running. After a few minutes, our breathing was very hard, but we escaped from them. We sat down, and I held my child in my arms. His crying and shaking made my fear burn again. I thought to myself, the world is full of cruel people, but we must continue. To stay alive, we must pass even the most terrible dangers. The rain was still falling, and the streets were dark and slippery. I held my child tightly in my arms. Every far sound made my heart shake. With every step, a new danger was waiting for us. This time, 3 men came out of the shadows. Their voices were rough and threatening. They tried to come closer to us. Running again was very hard. Our legs were tired, and our bodies were shaking from cold and hunger. At that moment, a light turned on in a nearby house. An old woman opened the window. She waved her hand and invited us to come to her house. Without a second of doubt, I held my child tighter and ran. This small and half-safe house, even with cracked walls, gave us short safety for the first time after many days. The old woman brought us a cup of tea and a little bread. My child put his head on my shoulder and smiled a small smile for the first time in a long time. Hunger was still there, and danger was still outside, but for a few minutes we felt alive and truly hopeful. In the dark, I understood. Even in cruel streets, small and rare help can keep us alive. This small spark of hope was the beginning of our next chapter and the road to rebuilding our lives. Morning came, but the streets were still cold and wet. I walked with my child next to me and looked at him every moment with fear. But one short moment was enough. His hand slipped from mine. He disappeared into a dark and rainy alley. My heart felt like it exploded inside my chest. I looked for the sound of his crying, but the wind and rain swallowed every sound. Every alley and every shadow was a danger. Cars passed fast near the street, and an accident was very close. Strong hunger, cold, and tiredness burned my body, but the real fear was losing my child. With my last strength, I ran toward the sound of his crying. Only a few more steps, and he could fall under a car or into the hands of dangerous people. At last, I reached him and held him tightly in my arms. His shaking and crying brought fear and pain back to my heart, but he was alive. For a short moment, we sat on the wet sidewalk. My child put his head on my shoulder and breathed calmly. In the dark, I understood. Even in absolute fear, survival is possible if we fight for each other. The rain from the day before left the streets wet, and the cold wind burned our bones. I held my child tightly and looked at every alley and shadow with fear. At any moment, someone could threaten us, or an accident could happen. Strong hunger made every step harder. My child cried softly. I found a small piece of dry bread and a little water for him, but it was not enough. Every few minutes we had to move. We could not stay in one place. Danger was still around us. Suddenly, we heard laughing and shouting from a group of young people in a nearby alley. My heart started beating fast. We had to run. With our last strength, we ran into another alley. I held my child tighter. Our feet slipped on the wet ground. After many turns, we found a short shelter. The door of a half-broken building was open, but this shelter was not safe. At any moment, dangerous people could find us. We sat down and took a short breath, but hunger and cold were still burning our bodies. In the dark, I told myself, our life is still full of fear and danger, but we must stay alive for my child and for myself. This moment taught another lesson of street life. Homelessness, cold, and hunger, but still, there is a small hope to continue. The wind and rain were still following us. I held my child tightly in my arms, and every far sound made my heart shake. Every alley and every shadow felt dangerous, but we had to keep moving. Suddenly, my child jumped forward in fear because of a loud noise. A car passed very fast next to us. There were only a few centimeters between us and the wheels. My heart stopped. Fear filled my whole body. I shouted and held my child tighter. My feet slipped on the wet ground. At any second, a terrible accident could happen. Strong hunger and deep tiredness burned our bodies, but there was no way back. We ran from one alley to another until finally we found another half-safe shelter. This time, a kind neighbor turned on a light and helped us enter the building. We got hot tea and a little dry bread. For a short moment, we could breathe calmly. In the dark and rain, I understood. Life is still full of danger and fear, but even the smallest help and a short moment of peace can start the road to rebuilding life. This short shelter was the first real sign of hope, even though the crises were not over. Another cold morning arrived. My child was still shaking in my arms, and every step made the cold and tiredness stronger. With a small hope, we left the half-safe shelter to find some food and continue our way. But one short moment was enough. My child stayed behind for a second and disappeared among the wet and crowded alleys. My heart stopped again. I could not hear his crying. Fear and worry grew every second. Every alley and every shadow was a possible danger. The risk of an accident or cruel people was always near. I ran and called him with all my strength, but hunger and tiredness burned my body. Suddenly, the light of a nearby house caught my eye. An old woman came to the window, waved her hand, and said, "Come inside." With all my strength, I found my child and ran toward the house. Inside, they gave us some food and water. My child put his head on my shoulder and smiled a small smile for the first time in a long time. This short moment was a spark of rebuilding and short safety. The crises were not over, but the road to life had started again. After the short moment of peace in the shelter, we had to go outside again. The rain had stopped, but the cold still burned our bones. I held my child tightly, and every far sound made the fear stronger. Suddenly, two men came out of the alley shadows. Their looks were hard and threatening. My heart beat like a drum. The only way to stay alive was to run. With our last strength, we ran through other alleys. I held my child closer. Our feet slipped on the wet ground. After a few minutes, the angry voices behind us became quieter. Our breathing was very hard, but we had escaped. Nearby, a young neighbor turned on a light and invited us into a half-safe house. He gave us some food and water. This time, we had a longer moment of peace and short safety. In the dark and cold streets, I understood. Life is still full of danger, but small and rare help can light the road to rebuilding. This spark of hope was the beginning of Chapter 3, where our family would slowly find stability. Another morning came. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still cold and wet. I held my child tightly. His eyes were full of fear and tiredness. But this time, it was not pure fear. We knew we were alive, and we had the strength to continue. The neighbor who helped us the night before offered us a place to stay for a short time and gave us food and warm clothes. This short shelter, even with cracked walls, gave us the first real feeling of safety after many days. My child sat on a chair and smiled a small smile. For the first time in many days, I felt we could start rebuilding our lives. Hunger and tiredness were still there. Danger was still hiding in the streets. But homelessness and fear were a little weaker now. This spark of hope showed me, even in the darkest crises, rare help and small moments of safety can light the road of life again. In the cold and wet streets, one thought came to my mind. Life is still hard, but we have a way to survive and rebuild. The first steps to rebuilding life. The rain had stopped and the air was calmer, but the ground was still cold and wet. My child walked next to me and smiled. For the first time in many weeks, I can see a little peace in his eyes. The kind neighbor told us about a local charity center. There, we could get food, clothes, and information about a more permanent shelter. I took a deep breath and thought, this is our first real step toward a new life. Hunger was still there. The tiredness of homeless days was heavy in my body, but for the first time in a long time, I felt control and hope. At the charity center, they gave us warm blankets and food. My child rested in my arms and slept with real safety for the first time in many days. This short moment showed me, even after fear and homelessness, it is possible to start rebuilding life. Morning came, and for the first time in many weeks, the sun shined softly on the wet streets. My child stayed calm beside me. He no longer shook with fear like before. With help from the charity center and the kind neighbor, We found a small and safe shelter. The roof was cracked, the walls were wet, but it was a real home for us. For the first time in a long time, we could breathe calmly without fear. My child played, and while I watched him, I understood. This is a small but real step toward rebuilding our life. To gain some independence, I found a temporary job. I helped in a small shop near the charity center. With every small payment, I felt I was taking control of my life again. Hunger and cold were not completely gone, but now we had a clear road toward stability and hope. In my heart, I understood. Even after the worst crises, life can begin again with help and real effort. The sun had risen. Its golden light shone on the cracked walls of our shelter. My child played quietly, no longer shaking from the cold nights of homelessness. I sat on a chair and watched him. For the first time in many weeks, I felt real calm. My temporary job helped us. Every day, I could save a little money, buy food, and get new clothes. The neighbors and charity center still helped us, but now we were taking control of our life. Hunger and cold were no longer immediate threats. They were only memories reminding us how hard it was to survive. I understood in my heart, life can start again, even after fear, hunger, homelessness, and danger. We had found our way, our path to rebuilding and real hope. I held my child in my arms and smiled at him. At that moment, there was no fear in our hearts, only the strength of family, hope, and the courage to face tomorrow. Thank you for watching to my painful life story. And if this story touched your heart, please give a like, subscribe, and just a comment to Avenue English Story so you never lose any story. Thank you again, and see you with the next story soon.